Most of us have already gone through something like telling ourselves that we need to stop doing whatever the bad habit is, probably hundreds of times, only to go back to it and to relive the same pattern over and over again. But even though we hate the cycle, we keep doing it. Let's be honest, you already know what your bad habits are. You do not need me to tell you what they are or even to give you anything to think about other than to say, think about your bad habits. All of us already know what they are. In fact, most of us have already gone through something like telling ourselves that we need to stop doing whatever the bad habit is, probably hundreds of times, only to go back to it and to relive the same pattern over and over again. But even though we hate the cycle, we keep doing it. And there's a reason for this. And it is not because we are undisciplined, it is not because we are lazy. And it's also not because of anything we cannot control or work on. And so, in this episode, I want to break down how to undo those bad habits, those things you already know need to be undone, replaced, or eliminated altogether in your life. And so we are going to dive into this subject today on the Known Disciple Project podcast, where we talk about all things spiritual growth and personal development. And I hope that you will subscribe and help us spread the word that this podcast is here for a resource for growth minded Christians, disciples of Jesus. So let's dive into this episode. By the end of it, we are going to have an understanding of what's really keeping our habits in place, why it's so difficult to sort of dislodge them and undo them, those bad habits. We're going to talk about how to rewire our brains from both a scientific and a biblical perspective, because this isn't just about behavior change, though there are some tactics for that we need to talk about. It's also about biblical identity transformation. So we're going to combine the two. And then we're going to talk about three practical, biblically rooted ways to start shifting your habits right now. So, before we dive into tactics and strategies and things we can use to move away from bad habits in our life, let's define what a bad habit actually is. And so, we're going to say that a bad habit, for the purpose of this episode, is any repeated behavior that moves you away from the life that God is forming in you. Okay. So, we're talking about mental health, physical health, spiritual health, being the best version of yourself that you could possibly be. Anything that is in opposition to that is probably a bad habit. And so, can bad habits be sin? Yes, of course they can. Sin can be habitual in our life, and that needs to be rooted out, burned away. And through spiritual development, ultimately, we need to turn away from sin in our life. But not every bad habit is a sin. Sometimes it's just as simple as wasting your time, dulling your senses, or draining your emotional or spiritual energy on things that just don't really matter. And so then you don't have emotional or spiritual energy to give when it does matter. An example would be maybe staying up really, really late on Saturday nights. And then when it comes time to get up for church on Sunday, you're just too tired. Was that a sin? I mean, maybe, maybe not, but it certainly wasn't a good habit, was it? Scrolling endlessly at night, affecting your sleep, or overcoming things that you're not called to do, that could be something that we consider a bad habit. Defaulting to food or screens again, or avoiding things that actually help you manage stress, all in the bad habit category. And they may or may not be sins. Most of the time, it's not necessarily sin. It's just something we've fallen into, a pattern we've fallen into that is keeping us from being the best version of ourselves possible. And it's critical that we have a focus on being the best version of ourselves possible, because it is very difficult as a Christian, very difficult as a disciple to spiritually develop yourself if you are physically or mentally impaired. If you're not physically or mentally on top of your game, then you're always going to have something to lean on that keeps you from your spiritual development. That's a big, big deal. That's why we're talking about rooting out bad habits today and focusing more on becoming the person you can be as a Christian. All right. So the question is, does this habit bring me closer to whom I'm becoming in Christ or farther away? That's the central question for today on and how we're defining a bad habit. All right. So, a couple of framing things we could throw out there for this episode. Spiritual formation isn't just about what you believe, it's about the habits that are forming your heart. And this is a good one from James Smith. He says, "You are what you love, but you might not love what you think you do. And your habits will always reveal what you love." All right. One more thing, and then we're diving into our segments for today. This is something that is not solved all in a day. We cannot change all of our habits or even get away from all of our bad habits in a short period of time. This is about consistency. It is about the long game in your personal and spiritual development. So just want to say that right up front. If you get to the other side of this episode and you're thinking, man, I'm going to change every single habit or change every single thing about myself, that's great. That motivation and that drive is really important. However, the formula, if you will, is always to change just one really important thing at a time until you get consistency with it and then do the next thing. All right, let's dive in to the very first thing today, which is your brain wants you to stay the same. It does not want you to change. So, this is one of my favorite things to talk about as a coach. And it is so cool to watch the light bulb go off in people's mind when they learn that bad habits aren't like magic. They're not something that is intangible and something that's just kind of floating in our head in the empty space between our ears. This is actually neurology, it's God's design, it's how our brains work. And so your brain wants you to stay the same because your brain favors predictability and safety. And so every habit creates this neural pathway in your brain that sort of automates itself in order to save energy, create predictability, and create safety. There's a really good model that you can look at if you love to read books, like I hope you do. You can read The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, and the model is called the habit loop. And it basically talks about how there is a cue, a craving, a routine, and a reward with every habit. And so, as you think about an example, maybe we could say it's 9 p.m. and I'm tired. That's the cue. The craving might be now I want to be entertained. And then the routine would be I'm going to pull out my phone and I'm going to scroll on social media. And the reward is going to be that I get a dopamine hit because I'm entertained looking at my phone. So the cue, the craving, the routine, and the reward. Each time I go through this loop of points, then I am creating a pathway of thought in my mind. Each time I go down that pathway of thought in my mind, I'm actually making it stronger and stronger and stronger. And so repetition of thought, repetition of action creates pathways, but it's not just that it does this like in the air. These are physical structures being created in our brain, narrow pathways being created. And so think about it like a truck going down a dirt road. Maybe the dirt road is wet, and every time the truck goes down it, it creates a little bit of a rut. And every time it goes down the road, the rut gets deeper and deeper and deeper because of repeated use. Now, think about what happens after 100 times driving down that road. The truck is going to have no choice but to drive down that rut. And if it wanted to get out, it's going to be very difficult to jump out of the rut and go drive on a different part of the road. Well, that is what the habit loop does in our brain, creates these ruts, if you will, of thought, of neuro pathways. And then when we want to stop doing whatever the bad habit is that has been created as a pathway in our brain, we've got to get out of this rut and we've got to create a new one. And it can be very difficult. And so, what we've got to do is purposefully and intentionally interrupt this pattern of thought and choose new thoughts. And it will be difficult at first because our brain resists the change. It wants predictability and it wants safety. So the scripture for this is Romans 12:2, one of my favorite verses. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. God designed our brains. This is not stuff we've just discovered. in the last, maybe 100 years in cognitive therapy and behavioral psychology. These are things that have been around since God created man. Our brains have always operated the same way. And God knew that it would be important for us to get away from thinking like the world does and transforming our minds. And the way that we do that is very important. Okay, so the second point here today is that habits don't just live in behavior, they actually live in our belief. And that's very different than just thinking that it's all about behavior and behavior modification. Backing all the way up to what you believe is critical in making sure that you have what it takes to start going down a new path. Okay, so many habits are driven by your underlying belief. Things like, I deserve this because I had a hard day. That's a belief. Or this is the only way I know how to cope. And then insert whatever your bad habit is. That's a belief. I'll never be free from this sinful thing. That's a belief. It's not just a thought, it's a belief. From the cognitive behavioral world, we say that belief leads to our thoughts, which leads to emotions, which leads to actions. Actions being your habits, oftentimes. And so, if we want to change our habits or change our actions, we're going to go all the way to the beginning of the formula and start to take a look at what we believe to be true. Do we really believe we'll never be free from this bad habit? Do we really believe that we can justify it by saying, this is the only way I know how to cope, or I deserve this because I had a hard day? So, to break these habits, we have to actually challenge the belief behind them. And so a great scripture for this is Second Corinthians 10:5, where it says, take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. So, in alignment with point one from today, when we recognize that we have a habit of thought that's taking us toward a negative habit, we choose a new thought. We take every thought captive, make it obedient to Christ. We choose a new thought that is God honoring. I will be healthy spiritually, physically, mentally. And we purposefully take that thought into a new action. Okay. So these are two very high level principles. One, that your brain wants you to stay the same. And the next one is that we've got to address our beliefs in order to address our behavior. You can actually start to address your belief by just listing out the things you would consider to be bad habits and then asking yourself, what do I believe to be true about these things? And then just be exhaustive with that. Really try to fill up a whole page exploring what you believe to be true. The truth is once you do an exercise like this, it can really open your eyes to where you are believing things that when written out, you look at it and you go, that's ridiculous. And it's sort of easy to pick a new truth. Others will be a little more difficult to get away from and maybe seated deeply inside of you because of your past experiences or how other people have shown up in your life. Either way, the work is the same. Ask yourself what you believe to be true about how you're showing up or about what this bad habit is, and then shift toward a new truth and a new belief that you could adopt until you begin to live it out. All right, let's dive into point number three. You can't just stop a habit, you have to replace it. Think about a time that you just completely spaced out. Like you were trying to think of something and it was right on the tip of your tongue, just right in the front of your mind, but actually what you were experiencing was this big blank void, this space. And you're going, "Why can't I think of the thing I'm trying to think of?" That's such a strange thing when that happens. And your brain hates that. Your brain absolutely hates a void. And so it will just start trying to fill it with all sorts of things. And for me, when I've had, uh, you know, points like this where I just couldn't seem to find the word I was looking for, or couldn't seem to find the memory I was searching for, I've noticed that my brain will sort of just start throwing things in there. No, it's not that. Throwing the next thing in. No, it's not that. Oh, no, it's not that. Because our brain hates a void. Well, habits are kind of like that too. It's very, very difficult to just stop doing something when you're trying to improve and get rid of your bad habits. Your brain doesn't respond well to just simply saying, I'm not doing that ever again. It needs a replacement to lock in a new behavior. Going all the way back to Charles Duhigg's model, the habit loop, it needs to have a similar cue and it needs to have a similar reward So the trigger and the reward, the two on the ends of the model. But in the middle, the routine, that's what we want to change. And that's the part we replace when we're thinking of bad habits. And so, if we want to stop checking our phone late at night, we've got to actually replace that habit with something else. If we want to stop stress eating, then we need to do something else that might be giving us the same reward that stress eating gives us. Reward being, again, that dopamine hit or maybe just that relaxed feeling. So, biblical principle here is that Jesus says when a demon leaves a person, it seeks to return. And if the house is empty, it brings things back and makes it even worse than it was before. That's Luke 11:24 through 26, kind of paraphrasing, taking the principle from that, which is that if we completely empty the space, it leaves opportunity for something worse to take its place. And so an empty space must be filled with something better. And so, what do we want to do? What do we want to replace these bad habits with? Well, that's going to depend on what the habit is. And again, going back to your beliefs about it. But of course, we could say we want to replace some of our bad habits with things like prayer, things like worship, things like journaling, movement, healthy replacement behaviors. That's what we're after. And so, going back to our practical thing that we could do to address our beliefs, when we ask ourselves what we believe about a behavior so that we can begin to choose a new thought, it could be something like what I've heard a couple of people I know use. They wanted to stop drinking, and they weren't even really terrible. They weren't alcoholics necessarily. They just weren't happy with the amount of drinking they were doing in their life. And so they identified that the cue was stress. When they felt stressed, the craving became alcohol, the routine became to drink, and then the reward became to actually be relaxed and in a different frame of mind. And so now they've addressed their belief that I deserve this. I've had a long day. And because of that, I get to have this beer or alcohol or whiskey or whatever it is. And they've changed it to have the same cue, which is I've had a long day, I'm stressed or whatever, I'm working hard. The craving is the same, which is I want to get into a different frame of mind. But now the routine is prayer and worship, and the reward is the same. They have changed their frame of mind, they're more relaxed. That's just one example of how you would replace the routine or replace the behavior with something different rather than just completely trying to cut it out of your life and leaving a void, which is very, very difficult to manage. So it could be something else. It could be as simple as instead of sitting down and scrolling on my phone for 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to go for a walk and get some blood moving. And so the cue is the time of day, or maybe you're between meetings, or that happens to me a lot. I'm between coaching appointments. And you could sit down and you could grab your phone and say, I just want to relax for a minute. You could pick up your phone, and the routine is to scroll. And then the reward is, I feel relaxed. It's a different frame of mind. Instead, we could change it to, I just have 15 minutes. There's a cue. The craving is, I want to relax and have a different frame of mind for a few minutes. Then the routine is a walk. Same reward. All right. So I think you get how this works at this point. You address the belief, you pick a new thought to believe is a truth, and then you change the behavior because of that. A practical exercise. I've given a few tips for you to sink your teeth into this episode already, but I want to give you some journal prompts. And so we want to keep this tactical and identity based because that's what we're all about here at the Known Disciple Project. Identity, then life vision, then life alignment in that order. And so here's a few journal prompts for you. What is one habit that's stealing life from you right now? Next one would be what belief is driving that habit? And then the third one would be what new habit can you replace it with? One that aligns with who God says you are. All right. And then if you want to borrow an affirmation, try this one out. I am not stuck. I am being formed. And today I choose to be formed by truth. Choose to be formed by truth. That's what we got for you today on the Known Disciple Project podcast, where we talk spiritual development, personal growth every single day. Help us spread the word that this podcast exists as a resource for your growth minded friends, Christians, and anybody who could use the information that we're sharing here. Until next week, be known.